I've described how at times they're requiring a new chapter in how we understand the essential growing up of the species that creative systems theory calls cultural maturity. And I've noted that one of the best ways to make sense of the concept of cultural maturity is to examine some of the new skills and capacities that cultural maturity's cognitive changes make possible. In previous episodes, I've described the importance of accepting a new, quite ultimate kind of responsibility, how questions of all sorts are requiring the ability to better get our minds around life's complexities and inherent uncertainties, and the need for mature engagement of the fact of real limits. Here I'll note one more. In times past, we've assumed that the truths we draw on were absolute, objective, once and for all. Creative systems theory describes how, when we step over cultural maturity's threshold, we come to better appreciate how truths that work are always dependent on context. They are relative to when and where we look. We don't need to look to human systems to find this kind of relativity. The realities of a bee, a bear, or a bat are going to be very different from one another. And while we might assume human understanding to be superior, in fact, if I were any of these other creatures, their view of the world would be more useful and thus, in effect, more true. We can think of creative systems theory as a framework for understanding contextual relativity in human systems. That it succeeds at this task is key to how it takes us beyond not just modern age assumptions, but also postmodern conclusions. Postmodern thought is often described as relativistic, but it is relativistic in a way that is legitimately criticized. I've described how the common result is an anything-goes world in which one truth is as good as another. Creative systems theory takes the essential next step. It offers an array of conceptual tools that let us make highly detailed this from that contextual distinctions. We could fear that this, rather than taking us forward, might have us lose even the postmodern achievement, that it would throw us back into a modern age rationalistic mechanistic reality. That it doesn't follows from how the theory, with its creative frame, draws on the whole of intelligence's multiplicity. The application of a creative frame lets us tease apart nuanced differences and have our distinctions affirm that we are alive and alive in the particular way that makes us human. The theory makes observations that relate both to temporal context, what it calls patterning in time, and more here and now systemic context, what it calls patterning in space. We got to start with patterning in time distinctions in the second episode in examining how we can understand cultural maturity in terms of the evolution of cultural narrative, in terms of the stories we tell about how things work. The simple recognition that culture's evolution has identifiable stages is itself radical and requires culturally mature cognitive changes to grasp deeply. But step back and it becomes obvious, part of the needed new common sense. Note, for example, how the fact that spiritual religious understanding has taken different forms at different times becomes quite obvious with reflection. In tribal times, the spiritual was animistic, the sacred taking the forms of creatures and places. Next, we find more polytheistic belief, as with Olympian Greece or the many gods of Hindu practice. This was followed by monotheistic forms, first of a more fundamentalist sort with medieval belief, and later with modern times forms that were more liberal and less severe. Creative systems theory not only maps this kind of progression, it describes how it is prescribed given how developmental processes in human systems work. It also predicts that with cultural maturity's changes, we should find ourselves capable of more encompassing kinds of conceptions, ways of understanding that both appreciate that each of these views are true in their time, and also how we might in our time be able to entertain more encompassing and complete possibilities. Pattern in time observations are useful not just for understanding the past, but also for making good decisions in the present. This is most obvious with how the concept of cultural maturity is a patterning in time observation and how it is able to provide guidance for today. But patterning in time observations can also help us with making more specific discernments. A simple example draws on the recognition that we find predictably different kinds of governmental and social forms with different chapters in culture's story. Prior to the Second Iraq War, leaders in the U.S. assumed that liberation by American forces would be accepted by the Iraqi people and that all would be well if the dictatorial structures of Saddam Hussein's rules could be replaced by more Western-style democratic institutions. An appreciation for the fact that the larger portion of modern-day Iraq exists in a cultural time roughly analogous to late medieval Europe would have made clear that neither expectation was warranted. Involvement in Afghanistan was arguably more justified, but given the modern-day Afghanistan resides at a time closer to 8th or 9th century Europe, makes related expectations there, and really expectations of success of any kind, there even less warranted. We see a dangerous failure to acknowledge temporal context today with populist thinking on both the left and the right. From the left, we too often find a naive judging of the past in terms of the values and beliefs of the present. And from the right, we often see denial that culture indeed evolves and continues to evolve. Neither stance can get us where we need to go. Patterning in space concepts concern here and now contextual relativities. We can use patterning in space distinctions to map roles in a family, departments in a university, or the relationships between different cultural domains. Creative systems theory's most developed patterning in space notions involve its framework for understanding personality style differences. Most people find it startling when they realize how different we can be as a function of personality style. In teaching about temperament differences, I will often divide a group up by personality style and have the various temperament-specific groups go off to different rooms with a list of questions to answer, from what do you like to do for fun to how do you know if someone loves you. Later, I have the small groups come back together and have people share how they answer the various questions. People's jaws can drop at what they hear. I particularly enjoy watching people's responses to answers to the how do you know if someone loves you question. Easily one might wonder how love between people of different temperaments could ever work. It is reasonable to ask how it is that we have tended to miss the profundity of these differences. Take the time with such differences in personality, and it can seem impossible to imagine that teachers could teach effectively without such understanding, or that psychologists could in any way be of help. The simple answer is that culturally mature cognitive changes are needed to fully appreciate differences of this sort. Without a deep engagement with our multiple intelligences, such differences are going to remain largely invisible to us. They can't continue to be. With the recognition that just how deeply our truths are relative to context, both temporal context and context of a more here and now sort, we again encounter our now familiar apparent paradox. In each case, our times challenge us to think more complexly, and this is no small thing. But it becomes straightforward when we begin to bring the whole of our complexity to bear. In the end, the result, when we think more contextually, is really quite common sense. We are just better seeing what is in fact the case, now including its contextual nuances. As always, I invite your observations and questions.